It's going to be on federally negotiated indirect cost rates. So we're going to start with Val. She's going to chat about her process, what she's done at her district for obtaining her approved indirect cost rate, and some of the steps that she went through. And then we'll invite Anisha up, and Anisha has a little bit of a different. We don't have a federally negotiated rate, but she has kind of an alternative method to capture some of those operating costs within her grant. So we're going to tackle this from a couple different angles, and then hopefully we'll have enough time for some good discussion, and we'll just take it from there.
Well, everyone, thank you for coming today. And first off, I want to tell you that I'm not an expert. I only have my own experience, so what you may experience is probably going to be different. Our history is that we started with BPA as our agency, and we are now with Bureau of Reclamation as our agency. So the cognizant agency is the agency that you get the most funding from. So of all your federal projects, the one that has the most in your final budget at the end of the year, this is based on your CFA. That agency is the cognizant one. In other words, they're the primary one that you have to go to for information on indirect rates, and they would be the ones you work with to establish a rate. So I'll go through some of the terms that we use first, just because when I first started this, it was very confusing to me. So I had to learn a lot of lingo just to start asking questions how to do this. So an indirect rate is a tool for determining the proportion of indirect costs that each program should bear. And that ratio is expressed as a percentage of the indirect costs to the direct cost base. So the base is the accumulated direct costs like salaries and wages with or without fringe benefits. And the things that you pay for directly under any different program, that's your base. The indirect is expressed as a percentage of that. So if you have salaries and benefits that add up to $100,000 or whatever, your indirect costs, if they added up to 25% of that, you would be allowed to apply 25% and claim that as part of your costs in your grant vouchers. So that's kind of how the two pieces work together.
Is there a max allowed for indirect rates?
No, I don't believe there is a max. There is, I would say you have to use a little bit of good judgment so that you may qualify for a higher rate. Well, let's say you had one that's similar to a university where it's like 45%. Well, that would be huge in a grant budget, right? It would eat up a lot of your grant. And it also makes it more difficult for you to be competitive in your applications for other projects. So it might behoove you to negotiate down to a rate just because you can justify it more reasonably on applications and be more competitive to qualify for other projects. So the cost pool is the total of things that are indirect, meaning you can't really pin it down to one thing. Like payroll, you're paying all of your projects, not just that one. And it's very difficult to chop your time up into little pieces and allocate it to each one of those grants. Some people do that, we don't. We stopped doing it a long time ago because it was too difficult to really capture accurately how much you're doing for each grant. So the indirect costs are the ones that you can't really spread evenly and fairly. Rent on your space, for example, operations and maintenance of things like equipment, other facility costs, and some of your procurement costs as well. So when you go to figure all this out, you negotiate a rate. So it's not just a formula that you use and bam, you have a number. You have to actually work with the cognizant agency or their representative to come up with this rate. There are 4 types of rates: provisional, final, predetermined, and fixed with carry forward. Provisional is like a temporary rate. It ultimately has to have a final rate. There are reasons that we avoided that. And the main reason is you don't know what the final is until you've gone through all of the process of establishing your rate. Meanwhile, your grants are marching along and you're using the temporary rate. You may have to come up with money to pay back at the end that you've claimed if your rate was too high, if your temporary rate was too high. For us, with as many grants as we have and all of the overlapping dates that we had, it was just too iffy. And we didn't want to have to be at the end of a 5-year project and have to be paying things back. So we decided that for us, at first, we were required to do the what's called fixed with carry forward. So you calculate your rate, you get an agreement, and then after the fact, the next year, when you go to negotiate, you have to look at what actually happened. And if that amount was over or under what your rate was for that year, you have to carry that forward and it affects your new rate. Compounding all of this, you have to have your rate application in within 6 months after the end of your fiscal year. So for us, we had to have all this calculation done at the same time we were trying to do our annual financial report. And then we had to apply it to the coming calendar year. So we're calculating, if I were doing it this year, I would be calculating my rate based on 2023 while I'm living in 2024 and planning a rate for 2025. It got very confusing for me. All that to be said, in the long term for us, the predetermined rate is the best. It's easiest. It's once it's determined, it's what you use. There's no going back. Once they've agreed to allow you to use this rate, they can't change it either. So you have a known quantity, and for us, that was the best choice. So, oh, by the way, I'm gathering this information from this website, and this is the FAQ section, which I found to be helpful because a lot of the questions that you have are in here, and it's easiest to use this as my guide to start talking about it. When we first started, we were using Bonneville Power Administration. They were our largest funder, and they had us going through Fish and Wildlife at Portland. We used the fixed with carry forward with them, and the process was somewhat simple. They sent me some spreadsheets to use and talked me through the situation, and we were in QuickBooks at the time, so we would just produce these reports that said, this is what we spent, this is, the things that are eligible and things that are not, and they helped me through it, the whole thing. When Bureau of Reclamation became our cognizant agency some years later, it was a whole different picture. Department of Interior is large. They deal with a lot of financial assistance, and they have lots of different agencies within them. So Department of Interior has a whole section that they use for this work. And so they're the DOI part of this, Department of Interior, but they have a business center. That's what the IBC stands for. And ICS is Indirect Cost Services. So way down in their hierarchy is where they do the cost services. But they do have a pretty comprehensive list of things that they give you as far as resources, and you can absolutely call them and just say, I need help. I want to start doing this. What do I do? And they're very helpful with that. So when you get through this, there's a couple of resources that you need to know. First of all, in the CFR, if you don't know what that is already, you should learn the federal
Go to federal regulations.
regulations, CFR, section 200 has an entire section on local government indirect cost rates and the rules that come around it. There are comprehensive lists of things that are allowable that you can charge, as part of your indirect rate, and things that are not. I would point out that the most relevant thing that is not allowable for us is all of our costs that have to do with legislative days and anything for WACD. And the reason that we choose to exclude that is that there is the possibility that any of our staff activities or costs related to those things would be used for lobbying. Lobbying is expressly prohibited. And so if we're going to be talking to legislators or they're, broadly on our behalf about funding of any kind, we just don't want to do that. We don't want to have that involved at all. So we choose to exclude all of our costs that have anything to do with legislative days or WACD. That includes dues. So our dues are not part of our indirect rate. So you'll need documentation for all of the things that you use as the basis. So whatever your accounting system is, needs to be able to produce you need to be able to produce reports that tell what you spent your money on and how you've coded it. And then your personnel records will have to be very specific. They have to talk about time. They have to be at least on a monthly basis. They have to include signed timesheets. So most people already have these things as part of their normal operations. The other thing that's not allowable is fundraising. Now, our district hasn't had a lot of that kind of thing, but if you do a campaign for anything like that, you probably want to be able to earmark that separately as well, so that you can carve it out. So another question that we got a lot is part of your package when you submit it is supposed to include your most recent audit. Well, we only have 3-year audits. We don't really have yearly audits at our district. So I had to ask, well, what can we use instead? We don't have this document that you're wanting. And they actually answer that question in the FAQs. You need a copy of the general ledger, trial balance, and or profit and loss that summarizes expenditures by cost elements such as salaries, fringes, supplies, travel, etc. So they just want to look at your books. And the person that you work with, the negotiator, may ask questions. They may ask you to explain line items in your descriptions. But really their ultimate goal is to come up with a rate that is defensible so that everybody can rely on it. Okay. We talked about who your cognitive agency is.
So that'll change as your funding changes.
They don't usually, like this, like a 1 year or 2 year difference.
Mm-hmm.
They usually don't want you to change it frequently,
Mm-hmm.
but over time, if the trend is toward a different agency, they'll want you to talk with them about it and get in contact with the one who is your primary funder.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're talking about awards given by just federal agencies, or because we get awards from local, state, and federal?
In this case, it's only federal, and then not all federal, just so you know. For example, those of you in RCPP or in task orders, or with us, it's cultural resources that have some federal funding with NRCS. Many, if not most, of NRCS's programs, their funding is not subject to the negotiated indirect cost rate. You can't claim it. So even though RCPP is a large amount of federal money for us, it doesn't count as a cognizant agency. So you have to look at those that allow it. And then you won't be able to apply that indirect rate to all of your federal programs. Most of them, yes, but not all of them. Yeah.
Just like your source from the bank, it's actually an EPA grant, your funds agency, EPA.
The whole process you're talking about is for the fixed rate or the predetermined rate?
The type of rate is part of the process. So the idea that you need one has to do with how much federal money you're getting. The process that you go through is the cognizant agency determines what process you use with them. Most of it is very similar, like you'll have the same elements of information that you give, but they may have different forms or different spreadsheets that they want you to use, different paperwork to get there. So why don't you pull up the NICRA,
Oh, you're,
the document, yeah. So this is the document that we ended up with, our last one, and it's the result of all of this work that goes into the background. So what you get is a determination letter that says, this is your rate. This is the rate we agreed on. This is how long it's for and how it can be used and the basis for that rate. This is what you have to send when people ask for your rate. Do you have it? Do you have any rate? Yes. So you send them this. So this is the culmination of all the work.
So what do you have asked for like a couple of years?
Yeah, we started out with a 2-year, but we were able to do our last one for 3.
Yeah,
You basically talk to your negotiating agency and they'll allow you how long, they'll allow you to have that for free.
And then to extend it, you have to do the whole process
You have
again?
to do the whole process again to get it in.
we used to, when we started with the fixed with carry forward, there was so much fluctuation from year to year that we have been doing it yearly up until last year. This last year, we felt confident that we were close enough to an equilibrium that we could agree to a 2-year. And our agency was finally saying, okay, look, you could do this for more years, we don't have to go through this every year. And so we agreed to a 2-year. Now we could ultimately, the 4 is I think the maximum that you can do. But you want to make sure that you're allowing enough frequency to adapt if you do end up with a lot more indirect costs. I suspect that we will, when we do our renegotiation, ours will probably go up some because we've added considerably to our capital costs in the last couple of years. And before that we had old used vehicles, and now we have some newer ones, and we've had to invest some money in those kinds of things. And our rent is a lot higher than it was before. We moved to a new facility and we have a lot higher rent, and that's going to make a difference. So for us, a couple of years was okay, but we knew we were moving, so we said, not 4 years, we're just going to go 2, and then we'll reevaluate.
The data apply to the main data for 2025 in 20.
Right, so in this case, it was 2022.
Oh, use 2022 data.
Do 2022 data negotiated in 2023 for 2024 and 25.
Predetermined 4 years, you said?
Yes. Yes. So it gets very confusing, but your agency folks are really good about helping you work through it. The reason for your starting is you have to have completed years information. So I was working in 2023 on this. I didn't have a whole year yet.
First of all, I need to have federal reference. I mean,
Yes, so you look at your CFA, and then from that CFA, you should be able to determine who is your highest federal contributor of funds. And that's overall, not programs, but the actual agency. And like Dawn was saying, it's the underlying. So if you have indirect grants, you're going to want to look at where the funds came from, under the underlying funds. So you want to go, where did the money is coming from? They're the ones who get to determine your process.
And that can make a difference on how much you get in your indirect faster too. Because we get some money from like WSDA, and their indirect rate with EPA is not as high as ours. And yet we get our rate, not.
Yes,
theirs.
right. If you have your own rate, you don't have to rely on the pass-through agency, whatever they say.
Even if you have Indirect, grant, you can still apply for that.
Yeah.
You don't have to, that's what, these two.
If you have a direct and you want to do this, you have to do it. If you have indirect, you can opt to it. If you want to make sure you get at least your 25% off, 10% minimum.
Right. So de minimis is one way of looking at it. You don't use just the salaries and benefits for that. I've never done one, but I do have the list of things you can include. And that is salaries and benefits in your fixed overhead type costs and your up to 25,000 of any sub-awards that you do, any contracting and sub-awards. You can't use the entire thing. Like if you had a huge installation grant for $400,000, you can't use all of that as part of that 10% calculus, but you can use up to 25 for each of those contracts. So in some situations, the de minimis would be better for some people, especially if you don't have a lot of staff time type grants. But the majority of ours are grants where we're doing the work, and the bulk of the costs are for things that we're doing ourselves. So that in that case, you're able to spread the cost out more equitably among your grants. If you have a couple of grants that are huge infrastructure type things where you have contracts and a couple that are staff, you probably want to have a conversation with the cognizant agency about what's better for you, because you can't do both.
Yeah, that's possible.
You can't
And
do
once you've established an indirect rate, you can never go back to the de minimis, even if the rate expires. You will pay.
Right.
You
You can't have
negotiate. That's your only option to get it.
right. And their whole purpose in doing this is to equitably share the cost of the indirect across your federal programs. So what they're wanting to see is that if you do $100,000 worth of salaries and benefits in one program and $50,000 in another one, they're each going to pay their share of your indirect costs by calculating this percentage rate. It's going to be more equitable across federal programs. But if you don't have a lot of salaries in the majority of your programs, that's not going to share it equitably because you're not using time, and that's the basis of how you're getting reimbursed. So it's not as, in their world, it's not as fair because it's not making all of the federal programs share the cost equally. All right, so maybe the next document to fill up would be the
Yeah.
that's a good one. So this is just the product of the underlying calculations. This is what I submitted. So there's a narrative piece, and then there's the spreadsheet type stuff that you send in. I'm going to just scroll through that. There's a checklist, and in this checklist, I found it to be challenging because I did a manual one with little actual check marks on it, but then you have to go in and put in the pages that follow and all that. So it doesn't look like I actually checked anything off, but it did. So then you just scroll on down. So first you have to tell your situation, who you are, what you're doing. And then you talk about certification, I promise this is all true, that kind of thing. You can see they allowed me to do a funky electronic signature on this. So you talk about how you do your accounting. Bars set you up nicely for this because you already have a lot of the categories that they want. So you just slide over there. In our situation, they want an organizational chart. So you do need to figure out how to make one way or another, but you have to put it in. And then going down, and this is where we talk about our staff people and justify how we're going to charge for their time. In my case, there are some grants that I do the actual vouchering for. So my time is direct charge to those grants. I exclude that part of my time from the calculation because it's not indirect, it's direct. The remainder of my time that I do for payroll and paying bills and that kind of thing is what is included here. So this description talks about these positions and how we're deciding how much of that time can be included in indirect costs. So that's basically all of our admin staff. This is where they want us to tell you. This is pretty simple, really, but I guess you could have questions, but we just use actual cost for pretty much everything. That's the surefire way to do it.
And they're really good about looking over your numbers and saying, what is this supplies? Because we take out obviously all the grant funded stuff. In fact, there's still a lot of district funded things, and at the time we didn't have any rates and charges, so it's like totally just us paying for this stuff. And then they're like, well, what's this for? Okay, I'll take this out, put this in, all that stuff. And then they come back with instead of the number you thought, it should actually be this rate. And you're like, oh, yeah, I agree, that sounds great.
So when during COVID, we were required to keep track of what we were spending on COVID related stuff. And when I went to do my rate at that time, I still had that kind of carved out separately. And they said, well, that needs to go back into your base. Even though you've paid for some of that with other funding, it's still part of your base, still part of your costs that you incurred that you would calculate your rate against. The same thing happens with your lobbying and promotional type costs. Even though you carve them out and say they're not indirect, you still have to put them back into the base because they're part of your overall operations costs. So that may end up with a slightly lower indirect rate, but it's what's true in their world. Okay, so I'm scrolling down.
That's it.
At the end of it?
Mhm.
Yeah. So to the next document. This is just an example for this particular one is a report I spit out in QuickBooks. And I would highlight the things that I was excluding or that I had questions about. So when I send it in, this is actually the final, but during the process, I did the same thing and sent it to the negotiator and said, okay, these are the things that I'm excluding and why. And then they could look at the printout and say, okay, what is this cost? And if they had questions, we would do that. We excluded fuel and repairs because at the time we had very low vehicle costs and all of our fuel and repairs were being reimbursed to us through the mileage collections in the grants. So in our estimation, that wasn't a valid thing to put in our indirect costs because we were being paid back already through the mileage rates. And so they appreciated that we were bringing that to their attention. We're not going to include that in our indirect costs. Auditing, they are actually acceptable.
Even direct bill of expenses to your rate.
Yeah. But if you don't, they can be part of your indirect. So it's all, pretty self-explanatory, but here again, it's excluded. Okay, so let's go on to the next.
Yeah, I got it on my screen. Let me just pull it up.
On there and stuff. Is that something
that, like, you couldn't do because it was part of the product, like, education outreach, like, what was it? that
In
you
that particular case, it was the facility space that we rented for an election.
always,
Elections are not eligible
Yeah.
either. In advertising and the space, because we were using a public facility and rented a little space in there. Just to make it more
is
easy.
your election held completely separate from any other event?
I mean, we tried to, this happened to be at a public market in Wenatchee, so we tried to schedule it when there was traffic in there for other reasons.
Mhm.
But, you know, all of our,
Our annual producer meetings. So then it all just is.
we have none such thing.
Mhm.
So-
We also, because we do the same thing, but we have, our accounts are set up so that it separates it. So we have election costs and appreciation. Annual meetings are separate, so we're able to. pull those
Well,
out.
that would be good, yeah. We don't, I mean, we just don't have other events. Now, this last year, we held the election at our own space, our new space, and had some fun event stuff going on at the same time. But we didn't have a rental cost, so the staff time to run the election is excluded. But the staff time that was there to greet our constituents and have some fun with them, don't have to take that out, because it wasn't related to the election. Okay, so this is the spreadsheet that we put together. Everything is separated into general operations and grants versus administration. And administration is indirect. The things that I can't say are exclusively one project or another. And then you end up with calculations to that effect. Now I thought we had to do this, but I did all the explanation of why we took out the WSCD and NEC. And whatever else I was suggesting. Highlighted some things that we direct charge for mileage reimbursement, for example. And what was it? Oh. And we had something that was coded to travel and wasn't really travel. Had to explain myself. Yes, it was an error in the books, but you know, at that point it was already done, so I couldn't really fix it. Anyway, then at the bottom, we decided to request slightly less than we could to allow for some margin of error. So we requested 25% for 2 years. So this whole exercise can take quite a while. I would allow a lot of time, you know, start early. But you can work with your agency and they're very good at helping you figure out what you need to do. But I think probably the things I would start with knowing is, what do you pay that is not allowable in the CFR? And what do you, just take a good look at that list and think through, what do we do at our district? And are these costs allowable? That will give you a good basis for how to manipulate your reports and how to identify the things that you're gonna have to answer for. They will ask. Especially if you don't have audited books, you're gonna have to give them the general ledger. Sometimes they'll ask for the whole thing. Mostly they just want the last page. It says, this is what you ended up with, which is fine, but you know, you need to be able to justify all of the things that you're putting into the rate and still have time to negotiate. So in Department of Interior's situation, they make you apply or prepare all this information and submit it by your deadline, but that doesn't mean you're going to negotiate by them. They have a lot going on, and it's usually 3 or 4 months before you finally hear back from somebody. I had one year where I was actually negotiating in December for the coming month rate. So, because they were that far behind, it was just that they had that much on their plates. But they will contact you, and once they start the negotiation process, you need to set aside some time to answer the questions and go through the calculations with them, and then eventually you'll come up with a rate. And it doesn't take too awful long for them to get the paperwork done after that.
So our fiscal year ends in a calendar year. So technically then I have until June 30th to submit everything, correct? Or,
If you were to start this right now, yes, you would have until June 30th. Which isn't a whole lot of time. You need to start now.
yep,
So, if this is your first time around, the first thing I would do is contact your cognizant agency, find out who you need to work with for your negotiation. And then just say, please guide me. Do you have a website? Do you have information for me? Are there worksheets and guidelines, things that I can use to get there?
Do you guys, like with your the overhead rates as well as with your federal rates and things coming in, are you guys able to net a positive, a gain on your funds? So like, do you have a rollover into your bank account every single year, or are you netting zero or negative?
I would have a hard time answering that question for previous years, but currently I think we are in the positive.
does that make a difference?
For sure. You always want to have.
In your operating fund, yes. Because you want to know that you're collecting enough to really offset those costs.
And there's always that liabilities of maintenance and truck equipment and things like that that always come up in the future. So the more that you can just gain in your pot sitting on the side, the better. And I know Mr. Mike back there had a great sheet of everybody's income in the bank sitting on it.
Obviously, it's not a profit-making situation, but the reality is there are lots of grants that do not allow you to have indirect rates for whatever reason, whether they're local, state, federal, whatever, you don't get one. So you're not able to collect that cost on those. So you need to be able to maximize what you're collecting that's allowable. As long as it's reasonable and allowable, nobody's going to be mad at you if you happen to have a little extra dollars left at the end of the year. But if you can't collect, you're losing all the indirect, because it still costs you to do those things. So if you can't collect indirect, you need to make sure that you're maximizing what you can collect. So if you have the option to go with 30% on an ecology grant instead of 25, do it. Because even though that eats into your grant budget and you can't get as much actual work done, the flip side of it is you can't continue operations if you don't have the funds to cover all the indirect costs. So
We can get really technical to do all of this.
I would say at least a couple
Distractions.
of weeks.
It's a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Initially, the first time, I think it might have been longer.
Yeah.
But then you've got this list of all the stuff they want. You're not exactly sure what they want. They give you kind of a template that you work off of. EPA is our cognizant fees, and they have a particular person she negotiated for like the last 10 years, something, all of them that I know of. Jacqueline is really good. And like you said, it's a couple of weeks and you prepare on the paper, you send it to her, she's like, now let me look at these numbers and this, then do them up and around, and then her time frame is maybe a week or two, depending on how busy she is, because that's all she does is negotiate rates for EPA. That's her title.
With Interior, their team is probably 4 or 5 people. I've worked with 2 of them, and they've been good.
Yeah, it's like a week later, they send it to your whoever has the authority to sign it. You sign it, she signs it, and your rate's all done, and our last one was 3 years.
So once you get to the point of negotiating, you need to be able to dedicate some time to answer their questions. But the process of preparing all of this packet, I would say it took me probably 3 weeks the first time I did it, and probably 2 weeks. But that's not all.
Nobody ever has one.
Well, yeah, I mean, I had to figure out how to make one. But you know, the paperwork part of it isn't necessarily all day, every day. But over the course of a couple of weeks, I spent a fair amount of my time doing those things. So, like I said, it's kind of hard to document that. And if you have time codes, you might even want to create one just so that you can keep track of how long is it taking you and how much do I need to budget for next time.
And then, like you said, you're looking at like this administrative, that might be the code put it in. But how much of that was election stuff if you don't have a separate code that takes out that. You have to calculate in your head, okay, so we have this many people, this time that take that out. And, you know.
Yeah, we finally created a time code for elections so that we could just carve it out without having to do it manually. I used to have to go through all the timesheets and figure it out manually.
Adds to our, like.
Yeah, I mean, it adds to the time it takes to do this. So the more detail that you have in your records, the easier it is to produce the documents you need for them. All right, well, are there any other questions? Yes.
For the creative side of me, I don't know if creative is the right word. If you knew you were gonna get a multi-year federal award, you would want to use all your own money to buy new trucks, put all your time into it the previous year, so you could make a lot of money. Or do they catch that?
Well, I think they might question it. I don't really know whether they would discount it or not.
Is this an annual thing with you, or is this a one-time?
Right.
Which they might back out the cost of your trucks because you don't
Yeah,
buy
like-
them every year.
For us this year,
But
we've
if you lease
got,
them every year,
2 new
then
trucks
you
and a-
own it at-
yeah, we have 2 new trucks and a new commuter car. We've never had a brand new vehicle in the whole time I've worked. And we're gonna have 3 this year. So, you know, previously we bought the chipper. Well, that was a big investment for us, but it was a one-time thing that we, you know, didn't even blink an eye at that. So it's, I would say yes, if you have the option to move it into that year instead of the next, maybe, but not extraordinarily larger than normal.
Particularly if you own the building, can you identify and rent yourself in space under administration? Establish a rental, say other portions of your building are already rented, you apply that as cost.
I'm not sure. I think that would come under the category of cost allocation plan, and I don't do those.
Yeah, I don't do that. We own our own building. These are big costs for our building.
You still have your operational costs
We
that you
just,
can
this
write
is
off there.
part of our operation to have it. If you were renting it to somebody, take out the rental part, everything else is you pay. You don't have to rent it yourself. This is what your district pays.
Yeah, I mean,
Plus
if
you rent to other people.
you had a mortgage, I suppose that could count, but a cost allocation plan is a whole different thing, and many state agencies have them, or subdivisions of state, because they'll get like copy paper for the entire department or the entire agency, and your department gets this chunk of it. They have to go through and allocate how much of the indirect resources are being spread amongst all the different departments. And that's not something that we have ever had to do, so I just don't even go there. So you'll need other help if you want to do that.
I think what falls out of those capital expenditures for general purpose. Never know.
It may not be. I would have to look into it. It's not really something that I've dealt with before.
You said to use the CEVA form to see whether or not where my cognizant agency might be.
Yes.
But on the CEVA, there's a difference between pass-through awards and direct awards. Should I make a difference between those? Should I just look at those who are direct reports or awards, or can I use?
Well, first start with your direct. Any that are indirect for that same entity would probably add to it.
And is there a threshold amount of the awards to be able to file for NICRA?
Not that I know of.
I don't think so, but like Val pointed out, NRCS, most of their contracts are CPP and those types of things. You don't get indirect rates, so they are not going to be a negotiating piece. You're not going to have NRCS be your person.
What about RCO?
RCO probably, yes.
Yes. Now, underlying them is probably EPA or, I think, depends on where they get their money from, you know, but if it's salmon money, it's probably commerce.
Salmon.
So, yeah. Commerce would be the underlying for that.
So we talk to them about their
The money that we get from RCO is through a pass-through.
And that's okay. It's just that the federal funding comes from ultimately where? That's what you want to look at. Again, they're different way, they each have their own way of approaching how you get to this rate, what kind of paperwork they want and that kind of thing. But they should have a contact for you that you can start the process with. I just shared this one because Interior has some really good resources on their website, even if you're not going to use them as the agency. They have links to the federal information that you need, and they freely share their resources as far as what is their process and what's the paperwork. They don't want you to actually submit it until you talk to them because they want to walk you through it. They want to guide you through what do you need to do for us.
Just a quick background to Media has how many employees and like what are you having to cover for your indirect?
We currently have 21 employees. Indirect for us you calculated on salaries and benefits, right?
Well, it's like if you don't mind sharing, like lease amounts and space that you have for everybody and things like that.
Well, I mean, we could go back to this. These are the things that we really find we applied for this. So our leases were. So the breakdown of what we were paying. It's different now because like I said, we've got some other stuff going on, but at the time, that's what we were making. So this is my actual document, so I mean, we're a public entity, what's the secret?
Yeah.
So, anyway, any other questions?
If you had like a mansion or something you didn't want to tell us about, that's all I was wondering. That'd be nice.
Like, if you have a lot of admin, like we do, that aren't grant funded directly, that really impacts your administrative costs. So that's why our rate is so high this year. We have administrative staff, my manager, me, at least half time, and Andrew. They're not covered under grants. They don't bill us out much under the grants. So we're covered. They want to do it their own way, our grant people, so. We get like 2 or 3 hours, and that does not cover a full-time person per grant, even if it's through grants, so.
And you can't.
I chose to do that. Right.
Yeah,
I mean, our negotiated rate is much higher, but we negotiate with people, ask for 30%.
Are you talking about like, so the employees of Cascadia are not writing it that way, or the grant manager of that funding source is not allowing you to put that much in?
Whoever's writing your grant budget, your application.
Yeah.
Has to write in, if they want direct costs in there, they have to write that in.
And yeah, how come you guys aren't having to do that?
We do.
Oh, okay.
They don't.
Whatcom does.
Their grant people do their thing.
Oh,
And that's fine, but mine don't.
I guess.
Might get yelled at if they don't put some time in there.
I decided that direct billing our administrative time to grants, and so.
And each district has to decide what works for them. With us, it ends up being a blend because I'm direct billing for things like vouchering and record keeping and that kind of stuff. But if they don't build in enough time for you to do that, you end up having to do it as part of your administration cost. So I just, we've just made it a practice to say you have to write in some time for this direct cost stuff because overhead is just too much in order to, they need to share in that cost in both ways.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
Okay.
take it away.
Thank you, Val.
All the hard stuff. I was gonna say, my RCO indirect is commerce. That's what I was wondering too. Look at that.
There you go. You want to run it yourself? Or you want me to?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Okay. And I'll just use my phone too.
Okay.
I have to look back at it. All right, everything should do with Columbia Conservation District. As Val mentioned, I am also not an expert. I've only been with the districts for 5 years, but I am following what I think is she at least has a ton of experience, was Debbie Nordheim. She was with the districts for 32 years, did a lot of this finance work and really brought a lot of different perspectives to the finance world for the districts in that time frame. I've amended a couple of things since then, just because things are evolving with grants and how we procure funding. And so there are some changes I've made, but a lot of this stems from her. So just wanted to add that in. As my slide says, we actually do not have any indirect rates with federal funding. So with that, we actually build a lot of our indirect costs within our grant. So any of our projects, we do the fun manipulating of finances to make it all work with the things that, again, are appropriate, that can be applied for that funding. And so what I'm going to do is just give you some simple things moving forward on how we can do just that. My slides are all just a bunch of funnies. So I did not want this presentation to be boring at all. So we are going to have a couple laughs as we move through. With this, I don't know how many of you, but I get just frustrated sometimes, and sometimes just like want to strangle somebody, you know, just please just give us the money, right? We see that in the SEC world and wanting more CTA money all the time. And then I put my sticky note saying, because I don't know about you, but I have sticky notes. And I try to number with them. Yeah. If you're a finance person, you have a million sticky notes. So, but yeah, the world of funding is difficult. There's definitely lots of different ways to go about things. I think that there is no right or wrong way. Like we've mentioned here, every district does things a little bit different. Just a little bit of background about Columbia. Right now, we only have 3 employees, and I do have a contracted financial person, and so she does all my bookkeeping for me. And so with that, there's not a whole lot that I need to do for indirect other than leasing, communications, things like that is normal. But it does still pose some things that we have to do to make sure that we're covering all of our bases. We still do have our lease, which is, I think, the biggest one is trying to figure out how you get your lease paid for. That is one that all projects, you just do a project grant, will not pay for. And so just to move a little forward, what was the grant finance world? Okay, so main questions. How does it fit, within a project scope? So how are we going to make all of the little components of our indirect costs fit into this project, or whatever project that you're going for? How do you determine the correct percentage use, right? So if you're like using Adobe, because you use Adobe on absolutely everything, or you use Microsoft Word 365 on absolutely everything. So how can you work that into a federal grant project directly instead of indirectly? And so with that, there's figuring out how you figure out that percentage. How do you read through all the manuals to figure out what exactly is acceptable and what isn't? So I'm sorry, but there's so many manuals. So, and it takes, oh yeah, they are so thick, and they'll tell you to go to page 525 and look at this, and it's just, there's too much. And then I like my last one. Which door can you kick down so you can strangle them into submission? So, which honestly is one of the biggest things you've got to learn how to do as a finance person, is to not let them tell you no. It's to figure out how you can make them say yes. So, and again, my crazy guy. So moving forward, tips, tricks, and other tidbits. So this is, Val did a great job at going through all of some of the technical lingo and what is it that is an indirect rate versus direct rates and things like that. So I'm glad, because now I don't have to go over it again. But with that, I can tell you there really is a way that finances don't have to suck. We can make this fun, and we can make this work, and we can make this a successful thing for everybody without losing our minds over it. And with that, all of I love this saying, because here is our simplified logic model. It really is and can be that simple. And it's basically just diving down and creating a template for yourself prior to going for funding. Don't go for the funding until you have your template ready to go on what your needs are for your district, and then move forward. Because once you can say, give us the money for these things, it's a win-win no matter what. So then, again, sticky notes. Part of that is being able to think inside and outside of the box. So don't get stuck within those parameters of all those manuals, because those manuals are gonna tell you the very specifics. Yes, like for instance, the lease one is one that I cannot get around hardly with anything. But almost everything else can be manipulated into that direct rate. And so with that, again, it's finding that magic number, it's working with your grant manager, and it's, like I said, not taking the answer of no. So figuring out how you can work and negotiate with them on that way, on how to make the project work for you. The other thing I want to add into that is that we as a district have BPA funding as our main funding source at 65% of our funding. The SCC and RCO make up the rest of 35% of the funding. When we look at our overhead costs or indirect costs, we split everything 65% to our BPA costs and 35% to our, actually just what we call our district costs. So it's any of the overhead that comes from the SCC. With RCO, we do sometimes maneuver some things in there and wiggle some things if we have to. But because we're blessed with that BPA funding, it really does help us in being able to get a lot of those operational costs paid for. So some of the tips. So it really is a list about that big about who will offer you operating support. So that is why, again, I say that we're so blessed to have the BPA funding. Unfortunately, for a lot of other districts, you're not going to have that opportunity, but that is where things like RCO is huge on being able to understand and maneuver through their A&E process, because you do have your project costs and you have your A&E costs. And with that, they allow you so much A&E to go against your project. And in that A&E can be almost everything else but your lease. How much time are you going to spend on that project for the year? And how much time are you using, you know, all the other things, your cell phones, all of your tech, all of your laptops, like whatever it is. If you're needing a tablet for that project, guess what? They can go in. If you're needing a program and you're just going to pay for Microsoft 365 for the annual payment every single year, you can write off a percentage of that on RCO. So there is ways to make sure that you can have this done. It's just being able to figure out which ways and what is the right percentage for you so that you can pass that, what I call, and Terry Bergman always told me, passing the red face test. How can you pass that red face test with an auditor that you are providing that right percentage moving forward? So part of that, like I said, when funders say no, you know, you just say a little bit maybe, right? So like, how can we make this work? Because I know for a fact, and I have worked with a bunch of them, where it's like, yeah, they'll tell me no, but then in the long run, we work it out and wiggle through it, and I get what I want. So it's all about just staying true to what your purpose is and figuring out how you guys can make that work. And then again, it's making sure that we don't think about federal funding as being so lateral or direct costs being so not lateral, being so straightforward. We need to like think about it being more lateral, just like the kid being sprayed in the face. We think it's going to come directly to our mouth and we're going to take a drink, but instead it goes everywhere. That is how the funding can be. We can have so many options. It can be so widespread. And it's just being able to figure out for your district just how it can fit for you. And I think too, one of the parts about that is the training that goes into funding or federal funding, as well as any funding. I know that there's not a whole lot of it out there. I had to get all mine from Debbie and then learning on my own and talking with grant managers. But again, then we all learn very different things. And so it'd be great and awesome if somehow we work this into a training moving forward so that everybody knows all these tips and tricks. So, tricks of the trade. So I say trade, don't trade down, must trade up, right? We never want to trade down. With that, you can see this office. Unfortunately, there's a lot of districts I know that have had to downsize when they don't have enough funding because they end up upsizing too fast, too furious, and then they end up having to be like this. And so biggest thing is knowing what is right for your district beforehand. Again, making sure that the template is there before you go for the funding. Making sure that you don't hire somebody for a project, not knowing that they don't have a project after that. Like you've got to really make sure that everything is lined up to where you can have a sustainable practice. With that, targets of indirect rate. So I know this is the way that we have ours listed out, which is lease, communications, equipment and maintenance, financial security, materials and supplies, and miscellaneous or other. A lot of grants don't like to see miscellaneous or other, but guess what? RCO totally lets you do that. So we have a miscellaneous or other section, and I can put whatever I want. So with that, it can either be materials for the project, it can be underneath your A&E, same thing, you can be having your communications and things like that in there. The biggest one for me is the lease. And so again, all of us here have the SEC's funding. So if you can somehow work out with your overhead with the SEC money that we know that we get, which is 25%, or whatever everybody else claims. I know everybody's a little different. Then you can have your lease paid for one way or another. Ours again, 65 BPA, 35% is against the overhead for the SEC. But the rest of those things can be built into your direct cost for grants. So it's all about just figuring out that right percentage. And again, for us, as far as projects go for our district, just to give kind of examples, we probably spend, I would say, like 50 to 60% of our time on river projects. That's where our big BPA funding comes from. It's all salmon recovery efforts, mitigation money for the two Cannon and two Chinook rivers. So that's where a lot of our stuff goes. The rest of it, though, I mean, we have upwards of 15 grants, and we've got our PPP, IE, NRI, VSP. We've got a lot of these different things that are going into there, so that makes up all the rest of our time. And so that's where we've determined that when we split things out, and again, funding source being BPAs are 65% of our funding, or more at times, then we go ahead and we split it that way. But for you guys, again, you're going to have to figure out where's your funding coming from, where is your time being spent. And even though your funding source might be huge because the project was huge, you don't necessarily have to split it out percentage wise just like that. You could actually put only 25% towards a funding source that's really big and use more because you put more time against something over here. Because you do need to follow your labor. So if your labor is really high on something else, you don't necessarily want to just put your communications and equipment maintenance and materials and supplies against something just because that's where all the money is. You want to follow the labor, because when the auditors come and say, okay, well, but you spent 85% of your time on this project, why did you not put 85% of your paper and supplies or communications against this? So that's something that you have to take into consideration also. And this part. So, other tidbits. So as told by memes, we are looking at a lot of different things. Everybody knows the saying, don't put the cart before the horse. But if you did put the cart before the horse, which some people are in that position as we speak, you just gotta start picking the horse. So we need to make sure that that horse gets in front of the cart. And if that means that you got to take a week, step back, look at your finances, really dive into it, delve out a template, call some people. I'm more than willing to help. I know that Val's probably more than willing to help. She's got a lot of experience. Then it's figuring out that template and moving forward on how can you make these federal grants work for you, and how can you start to reallocate those funds where you are at in the calendar year today to make sure that you're putting the percentages right so that you can start having that net gain in your bank every single year. Because that's why I asked Val about net gains. I believe every district should be able to have a net gain in their bank. You should always have a pot sitting there ready to go for any kind of emergency. Thankfully, Debbie was very frugal, and we have a very sizable pot sitting there. Again, we had a couple of sales that kind of helped us too. We had a tractor sale, things like that. Very minimal compared to overhead costs that we did not spend. So there's overhead costs. We allocate that. We know we're going to need it. So therefore it sits there until we need to use it. And so that part is huge, because if we ever need to move, we ever have a releasing, we ever have any of these things that need to happen for us, which hopefully we do. We're in a post office right now. So with that, it's, we have the money to be able to do what we need to. And if that's buying property, if that's, it just gives us a means to an end. But that's remaining frugal on your money and understanding where it's going and how to utilize the funding sources that you have to the most optimal way that you can, so that you are getting every penny saved into that bank. I said some funding isn't the right fit. So, and that really is true. Don't go after funding if it's going to just be hitting your head against the wall. I mean, just don't do it. I can tell you, of all the funding sources that we've had between the SEC, BPA, RCO, which, as was stated, get commerce money as far as indirect costs for federal that way. I have DOE money through all of 2050 watershed, DOE is impossible. So it is the most trouble. Eagle stinks. I don't like it. It's worse than CPDS. Sorry. I know Courtney's sitting over there. But it's just not fun. And so it's what's the point of doing that if there's an easier way to receive funding, right? And so with that, things like engineering. This last year, I needed more funds in order to make sure that I could start projects with engineering so that I could have designs to go forward and get the actual costs for that project. And so in doing so, we now have this wonderful PE grant from the SCC. Our Southeast area engineer was not using all of it. And so I was awarded the amount of money that I needed. And SCC, I can tell you, is going to be your easiest funding source ever to go to. As far as other federal funding though, and moving forward, I would say BPA is great and wonderful to work with. Unfortunately, like I said, that's not going to be for everybody. Otherwise, RCO, yes, it's a long grant process, but they are then the next go-to. And they are still the most, I would say, maneuverable to like whittle your way through and make sure that your funding's coming out of it. And if you have really good projects, that's the other part with RCO. I can say if you have a really good project, you can do a big bang for your buck. They like to have multiple projects together in one. So if you can collect several and throw them together, that is going to score you higher in the ranking processes. It's going to help you to have a bigger A&E cost amount that comes out of that. So then you can have more of your allocations for the year built up into that one grant. Again, I believe it's 25%. 25% of those you can do for A&E. So, but again, you don't have to negotiate that. It's just 25% of the funding. It's automatic. You can collect what you want. And then you can use it how you want to, as far as with the other things I had said before. And then, like I said, keep trying. There are new avenues evolving every year. With that, the differences, RCO has changed quite a bit since when Debbie's been doing it back before. Even our EPA dollars are changing every year. Obviously, SEC is being flooded with money, so there's changes that way as well. But always keep trying, always keep looking for different avenues. I think that there will be more ways for us to get operating costs in the future. And then I would just say be realistic. And this goes back again to the allocations of your money, federal or state or otherwise. When you guys have the money, make sure that you understand that it is not around at all times. And when you're going to look at the future, when you're gonna look at the future, you just gotta make sure that you're building for that. So again, don't hire people when you know that you're not gonna have funds for a long time. Don't get or rent places that you know that you're not gonna have funding for a long time. Don't put yourself in a pinch. So make sure that you put yourself in a comfortable position that you can stay at for a long time. Build that pot if you need to, and then move forward so that way you can have all your costs covered. And I do like the Mona Lisa picture because I swear that's every funding source. So that one was like my best name that I could come up with. So, and it really is true. They want to see that golden goose, right? So laying the golden eggs, and we want to have these beautiful, wonderful projects, and everybody, you know, big old districts, which again, we only have 3. There's other districts that have like 30 people. They want to see all of that coming out of things, but in reality, that's what they give you the money for. And it's like, what are we supposed to do with that? So the whole point is, what can we do with pennies instead of doing with millions, right? And so being able to work those pennies to the best of your ability is always a good tool to have in your pocket. And other than that, that was it. I just have all that. So I do have budgets, my BPA budget and my RCO budget that I can show you if you guys want to look at that. Which one do you want to look at first? Yeah.
I need you to do this rather than doing the NICRA.
Because so that is a good point. With indirect costs and negotiating rates and all those things, they are extremely nitpicky about what you're going to do with that. They want to see every single cost down to a penny of what you're going to be spending it on. And then with that negotiations, you can't spend otherwise. So there's no way to like go outside of the box once you're in it. And then it's a negotiated rate for the couple of years. That's what you get your money for. And you're not allowed to go outside that template and move laterally whatsoever. You're stuck inside of it. And then they tend to look at you a lot harder. Every grant does, every grant funder does. And so when you're doing the direct costs, they just don't, I would say it's less nitpicky. They allow you to move a little more freely. There's a lot less eyeballs looking at you the whole time while you're doing it.
You just create this template then of your direct cost by taking off your overhead and indicating this is direct cost for that program.
Yep. And especially because I mean, a lot of us are doing the exact same projects over and over and over again. Every great once in a while, we're doing a new project. But for the most part, like our salmon recovery projects, our river restoration ones, I mean, I have them down to a T, what the costs are going to be, how much time we're going to be sitting on them, what kind of paper and or machine use and or equipment use and or like whatever we're going to be using would go towards that. How much is my financial person going to be working on it? Those kind of things. And I just build that all into it. So with that, it's really small. I don't know if you guys can, maybe we can blow it up. So this is my BPA budget. With that, we have salaries on the top. Everybody can do that within project scopes anyways. And BPA, by the way, this is not a single project. BPA pays for our projects in general, which is just the Tucson and Tucson River systems that we do projects on. So this is a pre-allocated amount of money that we get every single year. We have to go through an ISOP process every single 5 years to I would say go through the terms and process of our negotiation of the contract to have another 5 years with BPA. Basically, we're just proving ourselves that we're doing good work on the rivers. And then we continually get this money every single year. With that, again, none of this is indirect costs. This is all just direct costs towards the project. So we have our salaries, we have our travel, and then down in the middle here would be all of what most people would do as indirect or overhead. And so that includes our insurances, lease, communications, equipment, computer support, financial security, materials and supplies. One thing that's nice about BPA is my bookkeeping services that I have is actually contracted into my projects. So that is something that they just pay 65% of right off the bat. So I don't have to actually put that in any of my operating expenses. She's just part of another project. Same thing with our cultural resources. But so with that, we have a rather large allocation every year that goes towards BPA. And then with this down here below, this is what our actual project scopes are. So then we have all of our different river projects that we're working on, and that's the money that we're allocating for either project supplies, engineering, and things like that. So great resource for BPA. Like I said, unfortunately, a lot of other people can't have that same resource. So I did bring up my RCO budgets as well, which hopefully everybody else knows. It's okay. Annual 18, you know. And all the others in between. So with that, because we have the BPA budget, our district uses BPA SCC for all of our overhead costs. I don't use RCO very much for those indirect costs, but that magical thing. So we have all of our project costs up here at the top. And then if you go down a little bit, you have your A&E. And this is the magical toolbox everybody should want to use. So your A&E can be so much percent of whatever allocation that you're asking for. And you need to make sure to use that to its fullest, because that is where you break down your percentage. How much in communication you think you're going to be doing? How much in materials and supplies you're going to be using? And that includes pens and paper and your equipment for like ink and things like that. So you can take percentages of that and put that in your administration costs and say, this is what we're going to be doing. Yep.
How do you do the backup documentation for that?
I just send in and put, all they ask me for is the invoice that we have on a monthly basis, which I turn in our RCOs every 6 months. I do a big voucher for that. And so then I take those, and if you are to use it, then you just highlight the amount on the invoice and then write down that you're requesting 35% of it. And it's just a note. And then you just write that in your allocation. So on Prism, when you go in there and do it, then you're writing down 35%, but here's the original bill, and this is how much I'm going to put towards it. Or whatever percentage you magically come up with. Yep. And we even do that for our labor, because so with that we have, because we have to do match, right? So when we do match to our RCO and we want to do like 20% match, I will have our labor, same thing. We will highlight it and say that so many hours was towards this project off of BPA, because some of it's for other things, the way that our time cards come out. And then that way they can see that that's directly allocated and as a match. And so then they just go through, their finance officer goes through and looks at it, pulls it out. But our voucher packets do tend to be very large, like pretty big, once we're sending them over. But we would rather send more information over than not enough, and especially with RCO. BPN, on the other hand, for us, they're a lot different. They only want to see our invoices if they're over 10 grand for any one individual item. So otherwise I can just ask them for the money and they voucher it back. Not saying that we don't keep records, because those records are there for any auditing that we ever have. And so that is a big deal. But with RCO, they do like to see everything that you're vouchering for. And so it's an invoice, we keep it there, we highlight it and mark the amount, and then just keep it part of the packet so you can scan it in and send it over. But again, when it comes to these projects, though, our projects are rather large. I don't know, I know every district is pretty different. If you're going for like riparian projects, or you're going through RCO for recreational projects, or whatever you're using RCO for, because there's lots of different grants to RCO. But mainly with our river projects, ours tend to be fairly large when we're going through them. So anywhere from $350,000 to $500,000. So when you're looking at that 25% that you can use in A&E is a huge amount. Like that's a great amount of resource to be able to use it. And what's nice with RCO is that they start you off with a 2-year, you can get extended to 3 years, and then you can get extended to 4 years. So that is a big process to use too, that if you don't use it all up in the same year, keep that funding there, because then you can use it by the time that 4-year term comes around. We always keep ours around for maintenance when we need to. So. Question? I know it seems kind of like off the wall and a lot to think about, but it really is doable.
And you mentioned that you're a small district.
Mhm.
Would this work for a larger one? We have all kinds of funding. I don't think that this way would be beneficial for us.
Well, what do you mean by all kinds of funding?
Just different avenues. I don't, what is your role?
I'm a district manager.
Okay.
Mhm.
So our district managers, our program directors manage most of their grant submissions on their own.
Mhm.
So,
So then for that, if you're a district that is allowing your employees to do their own grants, that's why I was asking, like, how is it that then the admin cost isn't being added into that? There should always be that person overseeing that grant to make sure that those finances are being taken care of. So that needs to be said. You're going to write this grant, then you're going to give me 15% in admin, or you're going to give me however much, to make sure that you're covering your costs. So to me, I would never let an employee just go off and like completely write their own. I would always want to check a little bit to make sure stuff is being covered. But at the same time, if you already have your overhead costs covered and you already have your admin covered and you're like, yeah, sure, go do what you want. I understand that too. But I think that there should always be, again, a template at the beginning of the year, knowing what your costs are, so that then whatever grant is written in the future, whether by an employee or by admin, then that grant can help cover whatever that template needs to be done. And that's where just sitting down and writing it all out takes a minute, but it's super important, because once it's done, then you can simply, go ahead and adapt things as it's coming in, but you have the template, so it's not hard ever again. Like, it's all there. So it's a really good process to start.
So we have a lot of different funding sources as well. We have Department of Ecology, we have FEMA, we have all of them, RCO. I think we have 10 different funding sources. So you would go through by funding source and follow the labor within those funding sources and create your percentages based on that to apply.
If you wanted to. If it's going to be a funding source like RCPP that won't pay for anything, then you can't do that. But if it's a funding source that will help you, then sure. But if you're like us and we have 2 funding sources that will cover everything, then why do the headache of splitting it out anymore? So that's where
You only use the funding sources that you can actually use.
Yeah. And there's multiple that you can, but again, why beat your head off the wall when you already have it covered by 2 very easy sources? Right. So pick your easiest ones that you know that you can go ahead and do the whole process through and then cover it that way. and leave the rest to project costs and labor costs, and then that's just simple. Mhm. Yep. Okay, everybody else is out. Can I go over time?
No.
Nope,
Okay,
on time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anisha.